All right, guys, so recently we did the Nutrition for Fat Loss series. Now we are going to do the individual training design series. The reason I called it individual training design is because we have to take the principles, methods, tools, ideologies, the research, all the stuff that we know about training, fitness, building muscle, losing fat, strength, all these things, and we have to create an individual design to fit you, the listener, the viewer, whoever is going to use these methods in order to actually train better and see better results. Because we can have all the science, all the methods, all the research in the world, but if we can't practically apply it to our individual self, we're not gonna design a good program. And I got so many people that gave me feedback on the last one, and when I asked about what we should do for the next one, everybody wanted to know about program design, and I think that's great. But we're not gonna talk about fat loss training or hypertrophy training or strength training, because the reality is there's gonna be a blend of everything inside of individual training design. Whether your goal is strength, hypertrophy, or fat loss, the principles and the methods do not change. How we use those as tools varies just slightly. So this series is going to be about creating your own program as a whole, individual training design, specifically for aesthetics, specifically for body composition. The people we work with at Boom Boom Performance mainly are targeting either fat loss or hypertrophy, building muscle. So everything we're gonna talk about inside of this, it is going to relate to building strength. It's gonna relate to hypertrophy, specifically building muscle, but it can relate to fat loss. And the reason I'm framing it this way is because I don't want anybody to watch this and be like, okay, that's cool, but I wanna lose weight. What should I be doing? Well, what you should be doing is following the Nutrition for Fat Loss series while training for hypertrophy. The best way to train when you are targeting fat loss is to train to build muscle. I don't care if you're old, young, male, female, doesn't matter. No matter who you are, you should be targeting hypertrophy-based training if your goal is fat loss. And the reason I believe that is because during this style of training, you are gonna build strength, you're gonna have better joint health, you're gonna still get some cardiovascular benefit to it, you are still gonna burn calories in the gym, and you're gonna more likely maintain hormonal function and actual muscle tissue during a diet. So if we're trying to lose fat, we don't wanna lose weight, we wanna lose fat. We don't wanna lose a bunch of weight and end up skinny and not like the way we look. We wanna lose fat and still maintain muscle, so when we get to that lean physique, we actually have something to show for. And that's why we're gonna talk about hypertrophy training in this. So again, even if your goal is fat loss, this is what you wanna do. Fat loss comes from a little more movement, so NEAT and or cardio on top of this, and nutrition on top of this. Your training will stay the same. And I just want to repeat that and preface that over and over again, because we work with a lot of people. I'm talking about thousands of people over the years that have been targeting fat loss, and we give them strength training targeting muscle hypertrophy during that fat loss. And it helps them much, much more. And the even better part of that, and the reason we're not talking about cardio in this and we're not talking about nutrition in this, but only hypertrophy training, is because hypertrophy training and what we're going to show you in this allows you to consistently progress and vary your stimulus. So let's take cardio for example. If we are doing 30 minutes on the treadmill, that's our cardio. Great, you're going to burn fat, burn calories. It's going to help you lose weight. I love it. The problem with that is your body can easily adapt to cardio, and there's only so much variation you can provide it. So after 3 weeks you've adapted, you need to change the stimulus because you've gotten so good at that cardio. Think of it like this. You're a hybrid now. A hybrid uses less fuel to drive. That's great for a car and saving money, but that's horrible for fat loss, because if we are more efficient at doing cardio, we're burning less fuel, aka calories, which is what we want to burn during that cardio. So what do? We add 10 minutes. Now we're walking for 40 minutes during our list cardio. 3 weeks go by, we've plateaued again. Now we're walking for 50 minutes. Are we doing more days of it? It's endless. But inside of this, we can change the variation of our exercise. We can change the order of our exercises. We can change our volume. We can change our intensity. We can add weight to the bar. There's so many things we can do that don't cause us to spend more and more and more time in the gym, but it still creates a new stimulus to build more muscle, burn more fat, burn more calories, speed up your metabolism, so on and so forth. All the things that are gonna help you effectively lose fat while maintaining muscle. So I'm gonna leave that long preface of the fat loss, because I know there's a lot of people watching this that wanna lose fat versus build muscle. But no matter if that's your goal or building muscle, this entire series is gonna be around individually designing a training program for anybody who wants to change their body composition. So part one is gonna be assess and execution. And there's a couple good reasons why we do this, but before I talk about why this is part one, I wanna talk about the different levels of these series so you can know what you're going to expect in the episodes. There's going to be 6 episodes in this series. So it's going to be about a month and a half long. We're going to launch it every single Monday. Episode 1 is assess and execution. So assessment and how to execute properly. The next episode, episode 2, volume, intensity, and frequency. This is how we gauge how much work is going into our program. How much total reps and sets are we doing? How hard are we pushing the load, the intensity of our effort? And how often are we stimulating muscles? So the frequency behind it. So we're going to talk about that. Number 3, and that's very, very important. That's one of the biggest keys in this. Number 3, part 3 is going to be exercise selection and tempo. We'll also talk a little bit about rest periods in there. And this is going to be basically what exercises are you fitting where? How do you kind of have a template or a skeleton, if you will, of movements and then be able to fill in the proper exercises for you? And how do you adjust the tempo, the variation, the rest periods inside of your program to get the most out of it? Part 4 is going to be progressions and periodization. How do you progress week to week? How do you progress month to month? And how do you periodize this over the year? We're going to break down how to set up the long-term scale of this design. After that, we have exercise sequencing. So this is actually similar to the progression and periodization, but on a day-to-day basis. So rather than looking at volume and all these different things, what exercises should go where inside your daily program, and why does that matter? And we're going to talk about that for energy fatigue purposes, but also for joint health purposes. And then the last video is going to cover recovery, RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion, and how to deload. This last one is kind of the icing on the cake that allows you to manage your intensities along the way during this individual training design to make sure that you can consistently make progress without burning out, and consistently work in the right effort and intensity zone to make sure that you're not falling short of your true potential or going too hard too often. So today, part 1, we're going to talk about assessing movement and volume, and we're going to talk about execution. So this one is going to be a little bit shorter and it's going to be more brief because it's a very simple topic, but it's very important because we can't even step foot into any of these other parts if we don't nail down the assessment phase first. A really cheesy line I always say to people that get on the phone with me before coaching is, this is like a GPS. I cannot get you to where you want to be if I don't know where you're currently at. Right? I need the starting address before I can get you to the ending destination. And it's the same thing with your body. If we're going to transform your body in any way, shape, or form, we need to know where you're at right now and where you want to go so I can give you the path to get there. That's why an assessment is so important. So the first part of an assessment when it comes to training is going to be the movement screen. And this is going to go a little bit beyond just doing an FMS, which I'm going to talk about here in a sec. It's going to be more than just putting your arms over your head and seeing how tight your lats are or how well you can do an overhead reach, but it's going to be about past injuries. So inside of a movement screen, what past injuries have you actually had and how have those affected you along the way? How are those affecting you now? We have to consider this before taking on a client or designing our program for a few reasons, but the main one being you don't want to further that injury. And if you need rehabilitation, that comes before any of this. If you are avoiding working on an injury, it's only going to exacerbate and get worse and worse. And then you can't even talk about volume, intensity, frequency, because as soon as you start applying effort and volume, you're going to get more hurt and you're not going to be able to do anything. So I am not a physical therapist and I am not here to screen you through a video camera. So what you need to understand is if you have any past injuries, that's the first checkbox you have to tick. You have to go see a specialist or you need to be able to handle it on your own. Find somebody that can teach you the proper things to rehabilitate that injury. But that's the first thing we need to be aware of. The second one is any current pain. This is a funny subject because there's some people that will say, if you have any current pain, you probably have a past injury or some kind of imbalance and you need to go back and work on rehab and mobility and things like that to avoid that. And although I will agree to an extent, I also know that there's some pains that will never go away. As we age, some things are unreversible. If you live a life, for example, if you live a life with bad posture and you've had protracted shoulders, tight hip flexors, and now you're 40 to 50 years old, it's not very likely that I'm going to be able to 100% correct this and get you into a tall posture. You're not pliable like a 14-year-old child is anymore. Bones of a young kid, joints of a young kid, I can manipulate those to an extent through exercise and actually change the way they stand and posture up. But at a certain age, you can't. So there's certain things you can't avoid. If you have pain in a certain exercise or movement pattern, it might not be because of an injury or an imbalance. It might be because that exercise is not designed for you. You do not have the proper biomechanics or levers, and you can't control how long your limb lengths are or how long your trunk is. how your torso is, certain people have different bone structure, and that might eliminate certain exercises for them. And if they have pain in those exercises, we can't shun them from it or tell them to do mobility till it goes away, because it won't. What we have to do is choose a different exercise that's gonna work with them. And we're gonna talk about that. But today, my point is, look at your past injuries and look at your current pain. When you bench press, do you have pain? When you overhead press, do you have pain? When you squat, do you have pain? When does that pain start? At what depth? Are your heels leaving the ground when you do that squat? Well, maybe it is ankle mobility. Like, what pain do you have? What current limitations do you have? And that's the next point here. FMS stands for Functional Movement Screen. This is a really good test that I suggest everybody go. I'm gonna drop a link in the show notes to where you can see more information about this. But essentially, it's an assessment. You'll do an overhead reach, you'll do an overhead squat, you'll do a standing inline lunge where you have to lift your leg, you'll do lying hamstring raises, you'll do a bunch of basic functional movement patterns, and they'll provide a screen for you. There's a bunch of different FMS style assessments as well, and you can even dumb this down. Reach overhead. Do your elbows lock out next to your ears? All the way overhead without your rib cage flaring up when you try to go over, without you creating forward head posture. If you do those things, we know that you can't comfortably and safely, while keeping your rib cage down, go all the way overhead. Even I have very tight posture where I want to lean forward. But if that's you, that's something you need to work on. We don't know until we do a functional movement screen. If you can't do that movement pattern properly without pain or limitation, what makes you feel like you should take a heavy barbell and press it overhead? Probably not much. You can do some lateral raises to build your shoulders while you work on that overhead extension, that thoracic extension, being able to keep your rib cage down and pack your chin while reaching overhead. None of this is available to you until you do a screen or assessment of some kind on your movement. So as we go through this, we learn our limitations, and then we can work on mobility, we can practice ranges, and we can stretch. So if I'm reaching overhead and I notice that my limitation, because I've done this functional movement screen, is my lats, right? If I'm reaching overhead and I get about here and I'm like, my lats are like pulling me down, I can feel that tension in my lats. Well, I might need to do some breathing and stretch my lats, and I might be able to reach overhead. It might not be thoracic mobility. It might not be anything else. It might just be that my lats are super tight. So what can I do? Hang from a bar, hang overhead, lay on the ground and put my elbows on a bench, stretch my lats, and deep belly breathe. When you deep belly breathe, it's gonna create a parasympathetic tone. So your nervous system actually calms down, and it allows you to release that tension. So now I go into a lat stretch, I breathe, 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 I get the tension out. All of a sudden I have more range of motion overhead. Okay, cool. It's not gonna be fixed overnight, but what that tells me is that stretching my lats is the most likely thing to create, or eliminate, I should say, that limitation. So it's gonna create more range of motion. And again, we wouldn't know that if we didn't do a screen, if we didn't look at current pain, and we didn't consider past injuries. So it might be practicing end ranges. So maybe you're just a little uncomfortable going overhead because you're not used to the skill, or don't have the kind of like a mind-muscle connection, but to your joints. If you don't have that connection or that thought process, that neuromuscular connection to be able to go, okay, I need to retract my scapula, I need to elevate my scapula while keeping my rib cage down. If I don't have that connection to my body, I can't create a posterior pelvic tilt while keeping the rib cage down and focus on my scapula moving. If I can't do all those three things together, I need more body awareness with my joints. So it has nothing to do with stretching or mobility. It has everything to do with practicing the skill behind going through ranges of motion inside of your joints. A good example of this is, what makes anybody believe they should do a heavy bench press if I can't comfortably, with load, keep my shoulders packed, aka my scapula retracted and depressed, which is gonna cause my traps, my lats, everything in the back to fire. If I can't be in this position and brace and create tension on that bar, why would I do a heavy bench press? Because if I don't, I'm gonna go into this anterior glide of my scapula, which is really just protraction, right? My shoulder's dipping forward. Now I'm pinching, I'm possibly gonna injure bicep tendon, a bunch of different shoulder issues, pec minor. Like, I'm not creating tension in my pecs because when I'm in this protracted position, there's no stretch here. Part of building muscle is creating the stretch phase. There's a stretch contraction phase. I wanna stretch the muscle and I wanna contract it. Stretch, shorten, stretch, shorten. It's the stretch, shorten cycle. That's why we talk about these things. But if I can't move my joints properly, I can't even take my body through the range of motion needed in order to create that stretch shortening cycle, which is what builds muscle fiber. So what we want to do in this sense is focus on practicing those ranges constantly. If you're doing a row, practice a 2-point row. Shoulder packed back, joints in place, cool. Now I'm going to row the dumbbell. Don't fire the muscles until the joints work efficiently, because your joints are what take the muscles through the range of motion. So we don't want to load that in a dysfunctional way. So I want to move on from that because I don't want to go too hard in that and work through the whole body, because that's a completely different series in its own self. But the point here is, once we find these limitations, we might need to stretch. We might need to practice the end ranges because we don't have the skill behind the mechanics and just getting our joints to move properly. And we might need to work on mobility. There are scenarios where you are just too tight in certain areas. You don't have the range of motion. It's not about connecting to your mind. It's not about thinking what to do because you know what to do. You physically can't do it. And I see this most often in the thoracic spine, so the middle of your back. This is in charge for extension. This is also in charge for rotation without rotating your hips. So if we're doing a rotational drill and we don't have thoracic mobility, we're gonna have some issues. If we don't have thoracic extension and we're trying to do overhead presses or lat pull downs or chin ups, I won't be able to get into extension and actually fully depress my scapula and fully fire my lats. One of the best things I did for my lat development as a muscle was actually improve my thoracic extension. Because once I did that, I could get a full range of motion. And studies show a full range of motion leads to more muscle growth because we're taking the body and the muscles through that full stretch shortening cycle that I talked about just a second ago. So we want to work on mobility to increase those things. A lot of people have issues with squats. Their knees hurt, for example. Well, your knees hurt because you have no ankle mobility and you're going into a squat. Now I'm leaning on my toes, I have no tension through my heels, and what happens when I don't have mobility in my ankles? My knees try to make up for that mobility when the knee is a more stable joint. What happens when the knee tries to do a job that's not its normal job? You get issues. And the easiest way to think about this is actually to look up, and I'll leave a link to this in the show notes as well, the mobility stability continuum. And this is the idea that every joint is stacked either mobile or stable, and it alternates. And this helped me so much kind of discover what clients were having, what injuries, and why. My ankle is mobile, my knee is stable, my hip is mobile, my lumbar spine is stable, my thoracic spine is mobile, and it goes up the chain basically. Stable, mobile, every other joint. So what happens when my hips are not mobile? My lumbar spine, my lower back is going to try to create mobility, and it's a stable joint, and then I get low back issues. Right? Or my knees try to make up for that mobility and they get issues. So the point with this being is a lot of times you do need to work on mobility, and you'll see that inside the movement screen. So at the end of the day, this first part of assessing is understanding past injuries, current pain, and limitations through a proper movement screen. You don't have to get too fancy with the movement screen. FMS is great, but if you don't have the equipment or you don't want to go that in depth, do a basic test to see where you are lacking mobility and stability, flexibility, and then go from there. Hiring a coach is obviously going to be a good way to go. This is why we have the Boom Boom Elite, which is our membership site where we create training programs. And I'm in there answering questions and talking about this stuff all the time, every single day of the week. And inside that group, we talk about these things. And this is one of the most important things. If you've never done a movement screen, you should do one. Because even if you don't have any current pain or past injuries, what it will do is reveal where you don't have a full range of motion. And once again, strength trained is where you have that strength in a range. Charles Poliquin has a really good quote, and I can't remember how it goes, but it's something similar to that. And what he's referring to is what you train is going to build strength in that range, right? And the best way to build muscle, shown by studies, is actually to train through a full range. So if I go do partial squats, I'm not going to build the most muscle possible. But if I can teach myself to get into a deep squat, a full squat, that's going to help me build muscle. Now, the only caveat there is some people aren't built for a barbell back squat. And we're going to talk about exercise selection in part 3. But the point with that is, just because you squat doesn't mean you need a back squat. You might not have the proper biomechanics or the limb lengths or the proper body period, joints stacked in a certain way to perform a back squat properly. But we're going to move on. The next piece of this that we have to assess is total volume. When we look at creating hypertrophy, changing your body, one of the biggest precursors of predicting muscle growth is volume. There's study after study coming out that shows more volume equals more growth. Now, there's diminishing returns. People shouldn't jump from 10 sets per muscle group per week all the way to some of what the studies have shown of like 40 sets per week. That's too drastic of a jump. You should jump the minimal effective dose. Add 2 sets first before you add 30. But my point is volume is still going to be one of the best ways to ensure proper muscle growth and or proper muscle maintenance during a cut. Neurological factors are implemented too, and those are important, and that's intensity, so load and percentage-based training, like strength-based training. We're gonna talk about that in part 2 when we cover volume, intensity, and frequency, but today we're just gonna talk about volume in general. We know that we have to hit a certain amount of volume. That's why there are the volume landmarks made famous by Renaissance periodization. A really great idea that there's this kind of bell curve, right? And the low end of muscle growth is probably somewhere between 5 and 10 sets per muscle group per week. The high end apparently is between 30 and 40. It's way up there. Everybody's individual place is gonna fall differently. It's based on your genetics, based on how much you recover, based on other stressors in your life, based on your nutrition, your sleep. But at some point in this bell curve, you find your sweet spot. That sweet spot is where you're gonna see the most muscle growth, and it's when you're gonna be able to kind of hit your maximum recoverable volume, which is a term Mike Israetel popularized that really helps us explain how much volume we can tolerate, still recover from, and still see growth from. So finding that is the key, but we can't find that, and we're gonna talk about that in the volume, intensity, and frequency episode. We can't even talk about that until we determine how much volume we're doing now. So the best way to assess this is to look at your training this week. Look at your training last week and the week before. If you've been following a typical program, like if you're following a structured program, you've probably been doing the same thing for the last 3 to 6 weeks. You're in a certain mesocycle, which is a block of training. You follow the same thing week after week after week, and you try to progress every week. That is a mesocycle, that's a program. If you were in that case, simply take the program that's on paper and count the sets per muscle group per week. If you do not know and you just kind of go in the gym and wing it, start writing down what you're doing. Write down what you did this week, and if you can remember, everything you did last week. And what you're trying to do is tally up the sets that you are training each muscle group. So if you did 3 sets of bench press, 4 sets of dumbbell floor press, and you did some cable flies, right? 3 sets of cable flies. 3, 7, 10. That's 10 sets of chest. If you did that one day per week, that's 10 sets per week of chest work, pec development, right? If you do that twice a week, maybe you're on upper lower split, that's 20 sets per week. Either way, you need to go through every muscle group and you need to track these. The bigger muscle groups are going to require more. The smaller muscle groups and the muscle groups that are hit indirectly, so like a bicep is hit from curls and a row, those are going to need less. And we'll get into that more specifically again in part 2, which will be really interesting. But right now, you need to assess your current volume and see where your current volume recoverability is. How much volume are you currently doing, and is that making progress for you? If it's not, you might need to add more. If it's too much and you're not recovering from it, we're probably gonna have to drop that. That'll be later on, but the point here is simple again. Assess your total sets per week. How many sets per muscle group per week are you performing on a regular basis? Write all those down, that's part of the assessment. The next part, gauge intensities. Intensities are gonna be load and percentage of 1 rep max. So what I want you to do here is look at all the sets you're doing, look at all the work. How big of a percentage of your total volume is coming from the 1 to 3 rep range? Better yet, 1 to 5 rep range. And how much is coming from the, say, 6 to 20 rep range? We have strength and hypertrophy rep zones. It's kind of a myth. We've debunked this idea that the 8 to 10 rep range is like the hypertrophy muscle growth myth, because at the end of the day, it's all volume. If you are lifting in a percentage above 80 to 85% of your 1 rep max, so you're lifting 80, 85, 90 to 100% of your 1 rep max, usually you are doing 5 reps or less. And if you are in that area of effort, that max intensity, that means you are predominantly working power and strength development. If you are working in the, say, 40 to 70% of 1 rep max, you're predominantly working in the hypertrophy rep zone. And it makes sense. When you're staying in the 40, 50, 60, 70% rep range, you can usually do 8 to 30 reps. That creates more muscle tension. That's more of a hypertrophy rep zone. But if you do a lot of sets of that 80 to 90%, so maybe you're doing sets of 3, but you do enough volume to equate to growth volume that we already talked about, it's not really a strength rep zone because you're building muscle from low rep training. But the problem with that is it's very neurologically fatiguing. It can take hours to get enough volume in. So we still kind of have, even though it's debunked, we still kind of have these like rep zones for hypertrophy and strength. My point with this is simple. You need to assess how much of this is coming from it. If you know that you're doing 20 sets per week, but you're like, I'm not growing, well, now let's gauge your intensities. If you go back to your intensities and you realize that 75% of your intensities are all in that low rep strength zone, you're not gonna build maximum muscle because your volume is coming from low rep sets. So that 4 sets of chest is nowhere near as much total volume as 4 reps of 10 reps, right? If you do 4 sets of 3 with a heavy load, the volume is lower than 4 sets of 10. Therefore, more volume leads to more growth. But we don't know where you are at unless we assess and gauge our intensities. When we are approaching hypertrophy, and again, this is going to be in another section, but just to give you a little teaser, about 2/3 to 3/4 of your volume should be in that quote unquote hypertrophy intensity zone. But before we get there and are able to kind of classify and categorize where your intensities are at, we need to know where they're currently at. So look at your training program, count your total sets per week, and then gauge how much of your training is coming in the high percentage, low rep training. So 80% or more of your 1 rep max inside your lifts, low rep training, and then how much of it is coming from, I would say like 60 to 70%, 50 to 70%, and it's usually higher rep training. Once you know that ratio, whether it's 50-50, 40-60, 75-20, write that down. We're gonna need that so we can adjust that in part 2 to make sure we get the most out of your gains. The last thing is the frequency and split. This is a completely another episode, but we need to again understand where it's at before we go anywhere. Your frequency and your training split is really just a tool to kind of individualize your volume, intensity, and frequency. If you know how much volume you need, how much intensity you need to understand the frequency, which is how often you hit a muscle group per week. You need to manipulate that to better handle the amount of volume you need to see progressions with your body composition. So if we know that we got to hit 20 sets per week, that's a very generic number, but that's a high volume for most people. If I need to hit 20 sets per week on my lats to see some growth or to maintain them while I'm losing fat, if I do all 20 sets in one workout, I'm not even going to be able to move my arms. My back is going to be fried. And on top of that, the volumes are actually going to drop because by the time I hit 10 sets, I'm so fatigued that my weights lower significantly. And studies show if I take that 20 sets and I split it between 2 or 3 workouts, I can lift more weight for the same given sets, and that makes my total volume, sets times reps times weight, a little bit higher. That's going to lead to better results and better recovery. So it's a double-edged sword of just progress. It's better success. So usually frequency should be a little bit higher, but this is where we determine our training split. What works for you? How many days a week are you currently training, and how many days can you optimally train? 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days? How many days a week works with your schedule and what's realistic and practical moving forward? We need to know that before we categorize and calculate all the volume and the exercise selection and progressions. All that stuff doesn't even matter if you don't know what your schedule and routine is and what you can actually adhere to. And then we can decide what the proper frequency is, not only from a science-based perspective, but what you actually enjoy. I know for me, I enjoy hitting each muscle group 2 to 3 times a week because I like feeling the stimulus of more muscle groups working. I don't enjoy going to the gym and hitting one muscle super hard and just frying it. And I also don't like hitting every muscle every day because then I never get a pump because I'm doing so many different things. For me, 2 times a week is perfect. Because I like it, I enjoy it. I can focus on a muscle for long enough to get a pump, and then I can recover better to do it again in that week and not have to wait a full week to do it. So some things to think about there. The last thing we're gonna talk about in part 1, which is assess and execution, is execution itself. Range of motion and the mind-muscle connection. If you don't have good form, which is gonna be a big indicator and it's gonna be a result of the FMS and kind of movement screen, if you can't execute an exercise properly, most of your volume will be what's called junk volume. Good example, if I'm doing a curl and I can't execute a curl properly because I don't have good mechanics and I don't have good mind-muscle connection to my muscles, I might get halfway, lean back and shrug my shoulders to get the barbell up. Well, what am I doing now? My spinal erectors on my lumbar spine are firing to put me in extension, which gave me more range of motion, and my traps are shrugging to get that barbell closer to my chin because my mind is just telling me get it up, and at that point, I'm not even working my biceps any harder at all. I'm shrugging and leaning back the weight. But if I drop the load, I create tension in my glutes and I stand tall and I go from a locked out position, which is a full range of motion. We want that stretch in the bicep. That's the stretch phase of the movement. And then we curl all the way forward, lift my elbows up until I get a full range of motion. Now I'm in this shortened cycle and I'm doing the full contraction. Now I've gone through a full range of motion using my joints properly and not activating any other muscle group. That is good volume. Junk volume would be leaning back and shrugging it up because now my biceps are doing 50% of the work, traps are doing 25%, and my lumbar spine, my spinal erectors are doing 25%. My biceps are barely working on a bicep curl. And that's my point here. You need to practice execution. Lose the ego, drop the weight, execute things properly, and practice a full range of motion. Learn how to activate your muscles. When you can do that, you will build more muscle, you will avoid joint pain and injuries, and you will see better progress with your body composition, no matter if your goal is fat loss or hypertrophy. So this last one isn't something I can teach you in today. It's just to give you a point and just make a statement that range of motion is very important for hypertrophy and muscle maintenance. So whether your goal is building muscle and gaining or losing fat, you need to practice a full range of motion. Mind-muscle connection is important to avoid junk volume and actually keep the volume in there. You could do 20 sets per week of junk volume and barely grow, or you could do 10 sets per week. So you'd be nervous system-wise, you'd be more recovered and less burnt out of good volume because you're actually using the muscle that you think you're working. And now we're getting way more progress by doing less and hurting ourselves less. But that comes from having a connection and having the skill to actually fire and activate a muscle. And avoiding the injuries comes from range of motion. Add to that, studies show a full range of motion leads to more muscle growth. So guys, to wrap this up, this is part one. I'm really excited about this series, but this is the individual training design series. You have to assess everything before you can determine what you need to do. It's the only way to be successful. We want to do a movement screen to discover what past injuries we have and current pains we have, and to go through an FMS, some kind of movement screen, to figure out our limitations so we can work on them and improve them. Next, we're gonna track our current volume. If we know our current volume and gauge our intensities and understand what frequency and split works for us, then we can look at proper programming later on. And last but not least, you need a full range of motion. You need to have the skill of firing a muscle, and you need to execute things properly so you can avoid issues and injuries in the future and actually get the right muscles working and avoid junk volume. Guys, once again, this is part one of the individual training design. I'm super excited about this. Be tuned for 5 more episodes launching on every single Monday on podcast and on YouTube and on Facebook, live on video or audio, whatever you prefer. And if you have any other questions, comment below. If you want more free content from us, check out boomboomperformance.com.